In April 2026, two U.S. Navy destroyers sailed straight into one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, and Iran responded with missiles, drones, and a fleet of small attack boats. What happened next did not just escalate a regional conflict. It triggered a global energy crisis that reached into your gas tank, your grocery bill, and your family's future. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water roughly the width of Arizona's Grand Canyon, carries 1/5 of the world's oil and liquid natural gas every single day. When Iran declared it controlled that choke point and would attack any vessel that crossed without permission, the world's economy suddenly faced a threat unlike anything seen in decades. American warships moved in to break that control, and what unfolded over the following weeks rewrote the rules of modern maritime warfare. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened, why it matters to you personally, and what to watch for in the coming days as this crisis continues to develop. Let us go back to the beginning of this confrontation, because the story starts earlier than most people realize. In late February 2026, Iran effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a surprise announcement or a formal declaration of war. Instead, Iran simply began requiring every vessel, every tanker, every cargo ship to get permission from its military before passing through. Think of it like a bully deciding one day that the hallway in your school now belongs to them, and you have to ask their permission to get to class. That is essentially what Iran did to global shipping. The strait is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and for centuries it has been considered international waters, meaning any nation can pass through without asking permission from anyone. Iran threw that rulebook out the window, and the world watched nervously as oil prices began climbing rapidly. Now here is what makes this situation different from previous standoffs. Iran did not just make threats. The country deployed an impressive arsenal of weapons specifically designed to make the strait a death trap for any ship that tried to pass without approval. We are talking about underwater mines scattered across the shipping channels, essentially underwater bombs that sit on the ocean floor waiting for a ship to pass over them. Add to that an array of anti-ship missiles positioned along the coastline, hundreds of small, fast attack boats that can swarm a target from multiple angles, and a growing fleet of attack drones that can be launched in seconds. Military analysts started calling this combination an Iranian kill box, meaning once you are inside that stretch of water, you are essentially trapped with multiple threats closing in from all directions. The narrow geography works against any large warship because there is simply not enough room to maneuver, and projectiles launched from close range give defenders almost no time to react. For weeks, American naval commanders faced a difficult decision. The economic pressure to reopen the strait was enormous, but the military risk of sending ships through that gauntlet was equally massive. Each day the strait remained closed meant higher oil prices, which translated into more expensive gasoline at the pump, higher shipping costs for everything from electronics to food, and growing anxiety in markets around the world. The longer Iran held its grip, the more leverage it gained in any future negotiations. Something had to change, and on April 11, 2026, the United States made its move. Two guided missile destroyers, the USS Michael Murphy and the USS Frank E. Peterson, began their transit through the Strait of Hormuz. But here's what made this different from any previous passage. Both ships turned on their automatic identification system, which is essentially a transponder that broadcasts their location to every ship and aircraft in the area. Military experts who analyzed this move said turning on that system was a deliberate signal. One professor who specializes in maritime history put it simply, "You do not accidentally flip that switch on a Navy warship." It was a purposeful message to Iran and to the entire world that the United States was not asking permission, was not seeking approval, and was going to sail through regardless of what Tehran said. It was a direct challenge to Iran's claim of control. Iran's response came quickly. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, which operates separately from Iran's regular military and answers directly to the country's supreme leader, issued a radio warning that has since become famous in military and diplomatic circles. According to a recording that was shared with the Wall Street Journal, the IRGC sent a chilling message to the approaching American ships. This is the last warning. This is the last warning. That was it. No explanation, no negotiation, just a blunt threat that any further advance would be met with force. The American destroyers replied calmly, stating they were passing through in accordance with international law and had no hostile intentions toward Iran, but would abide by their own government's ceasefire instructions. Then they kept sailing forward. What happened next is still being debated, but here is what we know with reasonable certainty. As the American ships entered the strait, Iranian forces launched a coordinated attack using multiple weapon systems. Cruise missiles streaked toward the destroyers. Drones appeared on radar screens. Small attack boats raced out from Iranian ports in what appeared to be a swarming tactic designed to overwhelm point defense systems. The U.S. Central Command, which oversees American military operations across the Middle East, confirmed that Iran had launched attacks using cruise missiles, drones, and small boats targeting both commercial and military vessels in the strait. But what happened to those attacks? Why are we still talking about this as a standoff rather than a catastrophe? The answer lies in the overwhelming firepower and defensive capabilities that American warships bring to any confrontation. The destroyers did not just sail through blindly. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and additional forces had been positioning themselves in the region. The U.S. Navy destroyed 6 Iranian small boats that attempted to interfere with the transit, according to Admiral Brad Cooper, who commands U.S. Central Command. The destroyers successfully navigated through the strait and entered the Persian Gulf, though Iranian state media disputed the American claim about destroying boats, insisting that none of their vessels were lost in the engagement. Either way, the end result was the same. American warships had passed through a waterway that Iran claimed to control, and the world was watching to see what came next. If you are finding this breakdown useful, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update on this crisis could change the entire picture you have been seeing in the news. This story is not over, and staying informed means staying ahead of the next development. Now let us go deeper into what this confrontation really means, because the obvious question that emerges is, why did Iran risk such a direct confrontation? The answer involves a complex web of strategic calculations that Iran has been making since the broader Middle East conflict intensified in early 2026. You have to understand that Iran has watched its regional rivals, particularly Israel, launch massive military operations that have redrawn the political map of the Middle East. Iran felt increasingly isolated, increasingly threatened, and increasingly determined to demonstrate that it could not be ignored or intimidated. Controlling the Strait of Hormuz gave Iran something it had never possessed before: direct leverage over the global economy. When you control the flow of oil that 1/5 of the world depends on, you suddenly become a player that everyone has to negotiate with, whether they like it or not. But here is what many analysts missed in those early weeks. Iran was not just trying to threaten. The country was actually preparing for a longer confrontation, building layers of defenses designed to make any American operation to reopen the strait as costly and dangerous as possible. Intelligence reports suggest Iran had placed hundreds of underwater mines in the shipping channels, essentially turning the floor of the strait into an explosive minefield. The IRGC had positioned anti-ship missiles along the coast with ranges and capabilities specifically designed to target large surface vessels. They had trained small boat units in swarm tactics that could overwhelm a ship's defensive systems by presenting too many targets simultaneously. This was not a bluff. Iran had genuinely prepared to make the strait a nightmare for anyone who tried to break its control. The United States, for its part, was not sitting idle during those preparation weeks. American military planners understood the killbox challenge and began developing countermeasures. Additional warships moved into the region, including a 3rd aircraft carrier that arrived with its battle group later in April. Thousands of Marines and paratroopers were repositioned, signaling that any ground component of a larger operation was being prepared. Long-range cruise missiles flowed into the Middle East, giving American forces strike capabilities that could eliminate Iranian missile batteries before they could launch. Military experts noted that Navy ships had been resupplying through the island of Diego Garcia, apparently restocking munitions for the expected confrontation. The stage was being set for a confrontation that both sides seemed to believe was inevitable. But strategy is never just about military hardware. Both countries also recognized that this crisis was unfolding against a backdrop of ceasefire negotiations that had begun in Pakistan. American and Iranian diplomats were meeting in a fragile process aimed at finding some way to reduce tensions and perhaps establish a longer-term agreement. For Iran, control of the strait was its strongest card. The country could point to the blocked shipping lanes and the rising oil prices as proof that it remained a power to be reckoned with, that any negotiation with the United States had to take Iran's interests seriously. For the United States, breaking that control was equally important because a successful transit would demonstrate that Iranian threats were empty, that American military power could overcome any obstacle Tehran placed in its path. Each side was using the strait to strengthen its position at the negotiating table. So what did the successful American transit actually achieve? That question depends entirely on who you ask. American military officials claimed it was a watershed moment, proof that Iran could not stop the United States from operating anywhere in international waters. They pointed to the mine-clearing operations that began immediately after the transit, with underwater drones sweeping the shipping channels in preparation for guiding commercial vessels through safely. Admiral Cooper announced that Central Command was establishing a new passage for the maritime industry, a corridor that would allow ships to move through without paying any toll to Iran or seeking Iranian permission. If that corridor could be secured and maintained, it would effectively destroy Iran's leverage and reshape the entire negotiation. Iran's response to that claim was immediate and defiant. The IRGC declared that the United States had failed to achieve its goals despite deploying overwhelming military power, and that Iranian forces had successfully challenged American warships and forced them to retreat under fire. Iranian state media reported that their forces had struck an American warship near Jask Island, though the U.S. military firmly denied this claim. The truth, as is often the case in modern conflicts, is somewhere in between these competing narratives. The American ships did complete their transit, which represents a tactical success, but Iran has not abandoned its broader control of the Strait's waters and continues to threaten any vessel that crosses without permission. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the United States should have pushed harder militarily to completely reopen the Strait, or was the cautious approach the right call given the risk of escalation? Your perspective helps us all understand this faster. While you are thinking about that, consider this next piece of the puzzle that most news coverage has completely missed. The real story here might not be about warships and missiles at all. It might be about economics, logistics, and the grinding reality of how modern warfare actually gets resolved. One energy expert who advises governments and major corporations described the situation as a game of whack-a-mole. Iran has scattered its threats across the Strait in multiple forms: mines, missiles, boats, drones. Each of those threats requires different weapon systems to neutralize, different tactics to defeat, and different timing to eliminate. You cannot simply bomb your way through this problem because new threats keep appearing as old ones get destroyed. The United States has been systematically degrading Iran's capabilities over recent weeks, reducing the number of operational mines and targeting Iranian missile batteries. But that process takes time, and each day it continues, the global economy absorbs higher costs. Here is what that means in practical terms for you and your family. The Strait of Hormuz blockage has caused oil prices to spike significantly, and that increase filters down through the entire economy in ways that are not always obvious at first glance. When gasoline prices rise, it costs more to drive to work, to take the kids to school, to go grocery shopping. When shipping costs increase because fuel prices are higher, those costs get passed along to consumers in the form of more expensive products on store shelves. Companies that depend on oil for manufacturing or transportation face higher operating costs, which can mean hiring freezes or price increases for their products. None of this happens instantly, but it happens inevitably, and the longer the Strait remains disrupted, the more those costs accumulate in ways that affect every family budget in the country. Now let us look at where this crisis is heading, because the coming weeks will likely determine whether we see a resolution or an escalation. The most likely outcome, according to most military and diplomatic analysts, is a gradual reduction of tensions as both sides find reasons to step back from direct confrontation. The United States will continue its mine-clearing operations and will eventually establish a safe corridor for commercial shipping, which will reduce the economic pressure that has been building. Iran, facing the reality that its threats have not stopped American military operations, will eventually be compelled to accept some form of face-saving arrangement that allows it to claim it negotiated from strength rather than weakness. Ceasefire talks will continue, and both sides have incentives to reach some kind of agreement that allows everyone to declare victory and move on. But there is also a worst-case scenario that cannot be ignored. If Iran escalates its attacks, perhaps striking an American warship or a commercial vessel in a way that causes significant casualties, the United States would face enormous pressure to respond with overwhelming force. That could mean strikes against Iranian missile facilities, naval bases, or even elements of the Iranian government that are directing the attacks. Such an escalation could draw the region into a wider conflict that extends far beyond the Strait and could potentially involve other nations with interests in the Middle East. Nobody wants that outcome, but nobody should assume it is impossible either, especially when tensions remain as high as they currently are. There is also a wildcard possibility that some analysts have raised, though it remains uncertain. What if this confrontation is not really about the Strait at all, but about something else entirely? Some observers believe Iran may be using the Hormuz crisis as a distraction while it pursues objectives elsewhere, or as leverage to extract concessions in negotiations that have nothing to do with shipping lanes. Others suggest the United States may be using the military operations to position forces for a broader campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities or other strategic targets. These theories are impossible to verify, but they illustrate the uncertainty that surrounds any conflict where both sides have incentives to hide their true intentions behind public posturing. So what should you watch for in the coming days and weeks as this story develops? Here are 3 specific indicators that will tell you which direction this crisis is heading. First, monitor whether commercial vessels actually begin transiting the strait regularly. If tankers and cargo ships start moving through without being attacked, that signals the United States has successfully established its safe corridor and Iran has backed down. If attacks continue or increase, that signals escalation is likely. Second, watch for statements from Iranian military officials about their willingness to negotiate or their conditions for allowing normal shipping to resume. Any softening of tone could indicate Iran is preparing to accept a face-saving compromise. Third, pay attention to oil prices and energy market indicators. If prices stabilize and begin falling, the economic pressure is easing and both sides have more room to negotiate. If prices continue climbing, the pressure builds and someone may feel compelled to take risks they would otherwise avoid. This brings us back to the fundamental question that sits at the heart of this entire confrontation. Can one nation legitimately claim control over a waterway that the rest of the world considers international? International law says no, but international law has always depended on nations with the power to enforce it. The United States clearly has that power, but using it carries risks that go far beyond the immediate military confrontation. Iran knows that, which is why it created this situation in the first place. The country calculated that the combination of economic leverage and military threats would give it bargaining power that military weakness alone could never provide. Whether that calculation proves correct depends entirely on how the coming weeks unfold. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz did not just change a waterway. It changed the entire calculation of how nations project power, how they protect economic interests, and how they respond to challenges from rivals who are willing to take risks that more cautious leaders would avoid. The United States demonstrated that it can sail warships through heavily defended waters, but Iran demonstrated that it can impose costs and create uncertainty that no amount of military superiority can entirely eliminate. Somewhere in that tension lies the future of the Middle East, the future of global energy markets, and ultimately the future of a world where the rules that govern international relations are being rewritten in real time. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe for our next deep dive. We are already tracking the next major development in this crisis, and it could change everything you think you know about who holds power in the modern world. The Strait of Hormuz story is far from over, and the stakes for every person on this planet are higher than most news coverage has been willing to acknowledge. Stay alert, stay informed, and remember that what happens in a narrow stretch of water halfway around the world has a direct connection to what you pay at the pump, what you pay at the store, and what kind of world your children will inherit. The next chapter of this story is being written right now, and you deserve to understand it.